Theodore steps out of his car, still glued to his phone, barking orders. Theodore. Into phone. No, that's unacceptable. I need those reports by noon, not a second later. As he strides forward, he barely notices Hazel sitting near the curb. She looks up as his polished shoes come into view. He's about to pass her by when Hazel, softly but firm. Spare some change, sir? Theodore pauses, finally glancing at her. His brows furrow as he registers her face. There's something familiar about her. But before he can place it, Theodore, distracted, digging into his pocket. Yes, sure. He pulls out a crisp $20 bill and hands it to her absent-mindedly, already turning away. Hazel takes it, but doesn't let him off so easily. Hazel, studying him. You don't remember me, do you? Theodore stops in his tracks, phone still pressed to his ear. He slowly turns, now really looking at her. Theodore, squinting. I'm sorry. Have we met? Hazel gives a bitter chuckle, shaking her head. Hazel, we used to work in the same office. Years ago. Theodore's face shifts. There's a flicker of recognition, but disbelief takes over. He looks at her again, harder this time, and then it clicks. Theodore. Hazel. Carter? Hazel. That's right. Silence stretches between them. Theodore takes a slow breath, clearly thrown off. He was expecting to step out of his car, grab his coffee, and dive into his corporate world, not to be confronted by a ghost from his past. Theodore. What happened? Hazel smirks, but there's pain behind it. Hazel. Life happened. She gestures at the sidewalk, the city, the chaos around them. Hazel, indeed. I was doing fine until I wasn't. Lost my job, then my apartment. One bad break turned into another. Now here we are. Theodore looks down, uneasy. He adjusts the cuff of his expensive suit, a stark contrast to Hazel's worn-out sweater. Theodore. I had no idea. Hazel. Of course you didn't. You moved up. I disappeared. Beat. Theodore shifts, guilt creeping in. Theodore. Is there anything I can do? Hazel studies him for a moment, then looks down at the 20 in her hand. She exhales, then shakes her head with a tired smile. Hazel. You already did. Theodore hesitates, as if wanting to say more, but his phone buzzes again. A reminder of his world. He glances at it, then back at her. Finally, he nods and steps away, vanishing into a nearby building. Hazel watches him go. Then she looks down at the 20, folds it neatly, and tucks it away. The city hums around her, indifferent. Hazel VO. Life has a way of surprising you. Sometimes it's a cruel twist. Other times it just reminds you of who you used to be. She leans back against the building, eyes scanning the moving crowds as the morning rush continues. Unstoppable, uncaring, alive. Here's the next part of the streets of the city, where the story takes a deeper turn. Hazel sits in the same spot, watching people rush past. The $20 bill still lingers in her fingers, like a decision waiting to be made. She exhales, slipping it into her pocket. A few minutes later, the glass doors of the high-rise building Theodore disappeared into swing open. Theodore steps out, but this time he isn't on his phone. He's looking straight at Hazel. Theodore. Hey. Hazel raises an eyebrow, surprised he came back. Hazel. Did you forget something? Theodore. Yeah, I forgot not to be an asshole. He steps closer, kneeling slightly, so they're at eye level. Theodore indeed. I was in a rush before, but I don't want to just hand you money and walk away. That's not enough. Hazel smirks, amused. Hazel. That's a first. Most people feel better about themselves after they toss a few bucks my way. Theodore. I don't want to feel better. I want to do better. Hazel studies him, trying to figure out if he's serious or if this is just another moment of temporary guilt. Theodore sighs and runs a hand through his hair. Theodore, I own my own company now. I can get you a job, something stable. Hazel's expression hardens slightly. She leans forward, resting her elbows on her knees. Hazel, you think a job is all it takes? Theodore, it's a start. A long silence. The city moves around them, but in this moment, it's just the two of them. Finally, Hazel exhales, shaking her head. Hazel, you don't get it. I wasn't just unlucky. I wasn't just laid off. I fell apart. And once you fall apart, Putting the pieces back together isn't as easy as just showing up to an office again. Theodore nods, absorbing her words. Theodore, okay, so tell me what you need. Hazel looks at him, searching for the catch. The part where he takes back his offer and walks away. But she doesn't see it. She just sees Theodore older, more polished, but still the same man she once worked beside. The one who used to stay late at the office with her, complaining about spreadsheets. The one who once made her laugh. Hazel, scoffing. You're really not going to let this go, are you? Theodore, not this time. She sighs, rubbing her temples, the weight of it all pressing down. Then, finally, Hazel, all right, you want to help? Buy me a meal first. Let's start there. Theodore grins, standing up and extending a hand. Theodore, deal. Hazel hesitates, then takes his hand, letting him pull her up. They walk down the street together, past the crowds, past the life that has forgotten her. But maybe, just maybe, she's stepping back into it. Theodore, still catching his breath. Wow, I thank you. That was close. Hazel, smirks. Yeah, well, next time, keep your eyes on the road instead of your phone. Theodore brushes off his Theodore E.T., still shaken. He finally takes a good look at Hazel, her worn-out hoodie, the tattered backpack slung over her shoulder. There's something defiant, yet exhausted in her eyes. Theodore, are you okay? That was quick thinking. Hazel, I've had practice. She shrugs, as if saving people from disaster is just another part of her day. Theodore frowns, sensing there's more to her story. Theodore, I should at least buy you a coffee or something. Hazel, shaking her head, you don't owe me anything. Just stay alert next time, all right? She turns to leave, but Theodore hesitates. Theodore, wait, what's your name? Hazel stops, debating whether to answer. Finally, she sighs. Hazel, Hazel. Theodore, I'm Theodore. Hazel nods, but she's already stepping away, disappearing into the crowd. Theodore watches her go, something tugging at him. He checks his phone again, but the message doesn't seem so important anymore. He looks back in Hazel's direction, only to find she's already gone. But Theodore knows one thing for sure: he's going to see her again. Theodore sits at a small table near the window, staring at his untouched coffee. His mind keeps replaying the moment Hazel pushed him out of harm's way. Something about her quick reflexes, the way she vanished so easily feels like more than just chance. He glances outside, watching people rush by in the cold evening air. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he spots her. Hazel stands near the entrance of a convenience store across the street, zipping up her hoodie against the chill. She looks around before slipping inside. Theodore doesn't know why, but he grabs his coffee and heads out. Theodore enters, the bell jingling as he steps in. He spots Hazel near the back, inspecting a shelf of protein bars. She glances over her shoulder, her body language tense. Theodore, approaching carefully, so, do you always save strangers from getting hit by bikes, or was I just lucky? Hazel tenses, then turns slowly, sighing when she sees him. Hazel, you again? Theodore, yeah, me again. I owe you. Hazel, I told you you don't. Theodore, I get that, but I still want to say thanks. Hazel hesitates, then grabs a protein bar and heads to the register. Theodore follows, watching as she digs through her pockets for a few crumpled bills. She comes up short. Cashier, you're $1.50 short. Hazel mutters something under her breath, stuffing the money back into her pocket. Theodore doesn't even think. He pulls out a couple of bills and sets them on the counter. Hazel, firmly, no, I don't take handouts. Theodore, it's not a handout. Call it repayment for saving my life. Hazel hesitates, then snatches the protein bar without another word. Theodore smirks. Theodore, you could have just said thank you. Hazel scoffs. I could have. She pushes the door open, stepping into the night. Theodore watches her go, but this time, he doesn't let her disappear so easily. He follows. Hazel rounds a corner into a narrow alley where an old backpack and a folded blanket sit tucked against a brick wall. Theodore stops short, realizing this isn't just where she's passing through, this is where she lives. Theodore, you don't have a place to stay? Hazel exhales, shaking her head. Hazel, and before you start with the pity, don't. I'm fine. I take care of myself. Theodore, that's why you reacted so fast earlier, isn't it? You're used to being on edge. Hazel crosses her arms, eyeing him suspiciously. Hazel, why are you still here? Theodore, because I don't think you're fine, and I don't think you should be out here alone. Hazel stares at him for a long moment, debating whether to trust him. Theodore, despite his well-off appearance and the way he carries himself, doesn't look at her with pity, just concern. And that's almost worse. Hazel, I don't need saving, Theodore. Theodore, maybe not, but everyone could use a friend. Hazel exhales, shaking her head, but for the first time, there's a flicker of something in her eyes. Relief. Maybe? Trust? She doesn't say anything, but she doesn't tell him to leave either. That's enough for now. Theodore leans against the wall beside her, knowing he's just stepped into something much bigger than he expected. And for some reason, he doesn't mind at all. Theodore. Hazel. Well, I owe you one. Hazel smirks, crossing her arms. You owe yourself. Maybe next time, look both ways before stepping into traffic. Theodore chuckles, rubbing the back of his neck. Fair point. You always this tough on people who almost get themselves killed? Hazel. Only the ones who look like they should know better. Theodore studies her, intrigued by her bluntness. There's something different about her, something real. He glances at her worn leather Theodore tee, the scuffed boots, the way she stands like she's always ready to move. Theodore, can I buy you a coffee at least? As a non-monetary thank you? Hazel raises an eyebrow, considering. Depends. Do you actually know a good place? Or are you one of those corporate coffee types? Theodore grins, sensing the challenge. I know a spot. Best coffee in the city. No suits allowed. Hazel gives him a long look, then exhales, amused. Hazel. All right. But if it's terrible, I'm walking out. Theodore. Deal. Theodore leads Hazel down a quieter street, away from the usual bustle. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of roasted coffee from a small corner cafe with dim lighting and wooden tables. The kind of place where time slows down. Theodore gesturing to the cafe. This is it. No corporate logos, no fancy names. Just good coffee. Hazel eyes the place, then nods in approval. Hazel. All right, you get points for this. They step inside. The warmth of the cafe contrasts with the cool air outside. A barista with a nose ring nods at Theodore in recognition. Barista. The usual? Theodore glancing at Hazel. Make that two. Hazel, leaning on the counter, skeptical. Bold move, ordering for me. What if I don't like it? Theodore grinning. Then I'll owe you another favor. Hazel smirks, but doesn't argue. They find a corner table. For a moment, there's silence as they sip their coffee. Theodore studies her, curiosity growing. Theodore. So, Hazel, what's your story? Hazel shrugs, avoiding his eyes. No story. Just a person trying to get through life without dealing with reckless guys stepping into traffic. Theodore chuckles, but senses something deeper. Come on. Everyone has a story. Hazel stirs her coffee, her fingers tapping against the ceramic cup. There's a flicker of something in her expression, hesitation, maybe even vulnerability, but it vanishes quickly. Hazel, maybe, but I don't hand it out to strangers. Theodore, strangers? I thought we were past that. You did save my life after all. Hazel, amused but guarded. That doesn't make us friends. Theodore grinning, leaning back in his chair. Not yet. Hazel watches him for a beat, her lips pressing together like she's trying not to smile. There's an energy between them now, unspoken, but undeniable. Sarah, tilting her head, intrigued. That's unexpected. Any particular reason, Mr. Carter? Theodore, leaning back in his leather chair, exhaling. Just find one. The best. Money's not an issue. Sarah nods, though she watches him carefully. She's worked for Theodore long enough to know he's not the type to make emotional decisions until now. Sarah, I'll put together a list. Local shelters, outreach programs, maybe a few rehabilitation initiatives? Theodore nods, distracted. Yeah, that. And find out how fast we can make an impact. Sarah scribbles notes, but doesn't leave right away. Theodore notices. Theodore. What? Sarah. Hesitant. This wouldn't have anything to do with Hazel, would it? A muscle in Theodore's jaw tightens. He doesn't answer right away. Instead, he stands, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlook the glittering city skyline. His reflection stares back at him, a man with everything except peace. Theodore, quietly, "Just do it, Sarah." Sarah nods, but as she turns to leave, her expression softens. Theodore Carter, the ruthless businessman, suddenly caring about the homeless? If Hazel had anything to do with this, then maybe, just maybe, she was changing him in ways no one expected. The office is dimly lit now, the city lights casting a glow against the glass. Theodore stands by the window, tumbler of whiskey in hand, but he barely takes a sip. His mind is elsewhere on Hazel, on the night he found her. Theodore steps out of his black car, his driver holding an umbrella over him. He's leaving a high-profile gala, but something makes him pause. Across the street, under the awning of a closed cafe, a young woman sits curled up, arms wrapped around herself. Hazel. She's soaked, shivering, trying to shield herself from the rain. Their eyes meet for the first time. Hazel. Defensive. "Don't stare." Theodore. Frowning. "What are you doing out here?" Hazel. Dry laugh. "Oh, just sightseeing. It's beautiful this time of night." Theodore glances at her worn-out sneakers, the too thin hoodie, the way she's trying to act tough but failing. He exhales, shaking his head. Without thinking, he shrugs off his expensive coat and drapes it over her shoulders. Hazel. Startled. "Hey, what are you?" Theodore. "Just take it." Hazel looks at him, eyes filled with something unreadable. Theodore doesn't know why he cares. He just knows he does. Theodore clenches his jaw, shaking off the memory. He never used to think about things like this. He never used to care. But Hazel, she changed something in him, and now he can't ignore it. A soft knock on the door. Sarah steps in, holding a file. "Sarah, I found a few options. The Haven Project focuses on long-term housing. Another Hope Outreach helps get people off the streets immediately. If you want real change, I'd suggest." Theodore, cutting in. "All of them." Sarah, blinking. "All of them?" Theodore, firm. "Donate whatever they need. Make it anonymous." Sarah studies him for a moment, then nods. "Sarah, I'll make it happen." She turns to leave, but pauses at the door. "Sarah." Theodore, "Whatever this is, I think it's a good thing." She exits, leaving Theodore alone with his thoughts. He sets the whiskey down, running a hand through his hair. He doesn't know what he's doing, only that he can't stop thinking about Hazel. Hazel sits on a thin mattress in a crowded shelter, pulling Theodore's coat tighter around her. She should have left it behind, but she couldn't. It still smells like him, expensive cologne, and something steady, something safe. She shouldn't care. He's from a world she doesn't belong in. But she remembers the way he looked at her that night. Like she wasn't invisible. Like she mattered. Hazel exhales, staring at the ceiling. Hazel, muttering, "Damn you, Theodore Carter." And yet, for the first time in a long time, she feels warm. Hazel's world. Setting. A dimly lit common room in the homeless shelter. A flickering bulb overhead casts soft shadows on the worn-out furniture. Hazel sits on a faded couch, surrounded by a few other residents. The air carries the scent of old coffee and damp fabric. Hazel, staring at her hands, as if seeing the past in them. "I remember the first time my art was featured in a gallery. It was surreal. People called me a genius. But what did that matter when I couldn't even save my own family?" The room is silent, save for the quiet hum of an old fan. A man in his 40s, Marco, leans forward. His face is lined with years of hardship. "Marco, loss does that to you. Makes the things that once mattered feel hollow." Hazel nods, her eyes filled with unshed tears. A young woman, Rita, fidgets with the hem of her sweater. "Rita, did you ever try to paint again?" Hazel lets out a soft, bitter laugh. "Hazel, I tried, but every stroke felt wrong. The colors didn't speak to me like they used to. It was like I had forgotten how to see the world, or maybe I didn't want to see it anymore." Silence stretches between them. Then, an older woman, Mrs. Jenkins, who has been knitting in the corner, speaks up without looking away from her needles. "Mrs. Jenkins, maybe you ain't meant to paint for the world anymore. Maybe you gotta paint for yourself. Hazel looks at her, something shifting in her expression. A flicker of something she thought she'd lost, a tiny spark of hope. Hazel's gaze lingers on Mrs. Jenkins, a long silence stretching between them as the weight of her words sinks in. She clears her throat, her voice shaky, but steadying with each word. Hazel. For myself, huh? Softly, to herself. I used to paint because it was like breathing, natural, effortless. Maybe that's what I've forgotten. How to breathe for me. The others look at Hazel, their faces a mixture of curiosity and understanding. Rita, the young woman, shifts closer to her, her voice quiet but eager. Rita, you could paint again. I mean, you still have that spark inside you. I can see it when you talk about it. Hazel smiles faintly, the idea of painting almost foreign to her now, but still tempting. She glances around the shelter at the chipped walls, the worn-out furniture, and the faces of the people who, despite everything, are still here, still surviving. Hazel, maybe I'll try, but I can't promise it'll be anything like before. Marco nods, as if accepting the uncertainty, but his voice is encouraging. Marco, it don't have to be the same. Sometimes starting from scratch is where the real beauty lies. There's a brief, awkward silence, but it's different now, lighter, as though something has shifted in the room. Mrs. Jenkins sets her knitting down and looks at Hazel with a soft smile. Mrs. Jenkins, life, my dear, is full of second chances. You just gotta be willing to take them. Hazel stands up, her legs a little unsteady, but her resolve growing stronger with each step. She looks down at her hands, once so familiar with brushes and paint, now almost strangers to her. But something stirs inside her, a whisper of possibility. She looks at the others, her voice steady. Hazel, maybe I'll start small. Just sketch a little. No pressure. For me. Rita smiles brightly, a spark of excitement in her eyes. Rita, I can't wait to see what you create. Hazel walks over to a nearby table where a few old sheets of paper and pencils are scattered. She picks up a pencil, feeling its weight in her hand. It feels strange, like holding something delicate yet powerful. Slowly, she begins to draw a small, simple sketch of a tree. It's not much, but for Hazel, it's everything. As the others watch her, there's a quiet sense of hope in the room. Maybe it's not about regaining everything she once had, but about rediscovering what truly matters. Theodore, because I believe in your talent, Hazel. You deserve a chance. Hazel's gaze softens, but there's a hint of skepticism in her eyes. She stands up slowly, stepping closer to him, her fingers still stained with paint. Hazel, I've been down this road before. People say they'll help, and then they disappear when things get tough. Theodore takes a step forward, his voice more earnest now. Theodore, I'm not like that. I won't disappear. I promise. Hazel looks at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. After a beat, she sighs and sits back down, motioning for Theodore to sit as well. Hazel, I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore. My whole life's been about surviving, not trusting. Theodore sits down next to her, feeling the weight of her words. Theodore, I get it. You've been hurt, but I'm not asking for your trust right away. Just let me help. Hazel looks at her painting, the vibrant colors contrasting with the melancholy in the room. Hazel, I don't know where to start. I've been stuck for so long. Theodore, we'll start small, one step at a time, but you have to promise me you'll try. She hesitates, then nods slightly. Hazel, okay, one step. But if I fall, I'm not getting back up. Theodore, then I'll be there to help you stand again. They sit in silence for a while, the sound of the paintbrush tapping against the canvas filling the room. A new, unspoken understanding begins to form between them. Theodore, so, what's the next step for your art? Hazel smiles faintly, looking up at him with a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Hazel, maybe a gallery. I don't know yet, but it's a start. Theodore smiles, feeling a flicker of hope as well. Theodore, then we'll get you one. The next day, Theodore begins making calls, reaching out to gallery owners and artists he knows in hopes of finding the right opportunity for Hazel. He's persistent, determined to give her a real chance. Meanwhile, Hazel spends her days at the shelter, working on her art, but the doubt still lingers in her mind. She's unsure if it's worth trusting someone else again, unsure if she's ready to take the leap. Later that week, Theodore arrives at the shelter with good news. He finds Hazel in the same corner where he first saw her painting. "Theodore, I found a place for you. There's a gallery opening next month. They're looking for new artists and they love your work." Hazel looks up from her painting, her brush paused midair. She doesn't know whether to feel excited or cautious. "Hazel, a gallery? You really think they'll want my stuff?" Theodore crouches beside her, his eyes filled with sincerity. "Theodore, I wouldn't have put you forward if I didn't believe it. They saw your work, Hazel. It's incredible. You just need to trust that you have what it takes." Hazel stands up, her legs feeling unsteady. She steps back and looks at her painting with a mix of admiration and doubt. "Hazel, I don't know if I'm ready for all of this. What if it doesn't work out? What if I fail?" "Theodore, you won't know unless you try. And even if it doesn't work out, you'll never know if you don't give it a shot. But I'll be here, no matter what." Hazel takes a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She looks back at Theodore, the walls she's built around herself starting to crack just a little. "Hazel, what if I can't handle it? What if I get too scared and give up?" Theodore stands up, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Theodore, I'll be there to catch you, Hazel. We'll take it one step at a time, together." She looks into his eyes, searching for something that would make the fear inside her settle. For the first time in a long while, she feels a glimmer of hope. She nods, a soft resolve beginning to form in her heart. "Hazel, okay, I'll do it." Theodore smiles, his eyes lighting up with pride. "Theodore, that's the spirit. You got this, Hazel, and I've got your back." Theodore's office. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead seemed to intensify the silence as Theodore sat at his desk, flipping through a stack of papers. His office was minimalist, clean, efficient, much like the man himself. But today, the tension in the air was palpable. David stood across from him, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "David," voice rising in disbelief. "You can't be serious about this woman. She's homeless." Theodore's jaw tightened, but his resolve didn't waver. He stood up slowly, the weight of his words deliberate. "Theodore," calm but firm. "She's more than that. She's talented and deserves a chance." David scoffed, clearly dismissing the idea as some fleeting infatuation. He ran a hand through his graying hair, trying to find the right words to make Theodore see reason. David, shaking his head, "Theodore, you can't be serious. We're talking about someone who is nothing. No job, no stability. Do you really think you're going to fix that with whatever this is?" Theodore's gaze was unwavering, as if he had already made up his mind about Hazel long ago, before David had even entered the picture. "Theodore," voice soft but sure, "it's not about fixing her, David. It's about giving her a chance. She's got potential, real potential. She's not asking for a handout. She's working on her art, doing what she can to survive. That's more than a lot of people can say." David looked at him, disbelief still evident on his face. It wasn't like Theodore to make such personal decisions. Everything had always been calculated, precise. This was something else entirely. David, incredulous. "And you think that's enough to build a future on? You're a businessman, Theodore. You can't let your personal feelings cloud your judgment. There's too much at stake here." Theodore leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. His tone had softened, but was laced with determination. "Theodore, steadfast. Maybe it's time to stop thinking of everything as a transaction, David. Life isn't just about what you can measure and control. Sometimes it's about trust, about taking risks. I'm willing to take that risk with her." David stared at him for a long moment, the weight of his words sinking in. He'd known Theodore for years, but this was something different, something personal, and it made him uneasy. "David," sighing, his voice tinged with concern, "I just don't want you to get hurt. You've always been smart with your decisions. But this could destroy you." Theodore didn't flinch. He knew the stakes. But he also knew something David didn't. "Theodore," quietly, with a rare vulnerability, "sometimes you have to lose everything to realize what's worth keeping." There was a pause, the room heavy with unspoken words. David wanted to argue more, but something in Theodore's expression told him this was no longer up for debate. With a final, resigned sigh, David turned toward the door. David, grumbling under his breath, I hope you know what you're doing. Theodore watched him leave, his gaze lingering on the empty doorway. He wasn't sure himself, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something beyond certainty. He felt alive. As Theodore returned to his desk, his thoughts drifted to Hazel, her raw talent, her fire, and the connection they had shared since that first chance encounter. He knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let her slip away. The door clicked shut behind David, leaving Theodore alone in the stillness of the office. His fingers drummed absently on the desk, but his mind was far from the papers in front of him. He could still hear David's words echoing in his head, the skepticism, the concern. But the more he thought about it, the more Theodore was certain of one thing. He couldn't let go of Hazel. She was more than a lost cause. She had dreams, ideas raw and unrefined. Yes, but Theodore saw something in her that no one else did. It wasn't just the art she created or the determination in her eyes. It was the fire in her spirit, the way she refused to let the world define her. There was potential there, not just in her work, but in the person she was becoming. Theodore's phone buzzed on the desk, breaking his train of thought. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from Hazel. Hazel, text message. I've been thinking about what you said, about taking a chance. Maybe I'm not as ready as I thought, but I want to be. I'll be at the gallery tomorrow. Hope to see you there. Theodore smiled softly, his chest tightening with a mixture of pride and uncertainty. He didn't know what the future held, didn't know if Hazel was ready to embrace the opportunities that might come her way. But one thing he was sure of, he wouldn't let her go through it alone. With a quiet resolve, Theodore stood from his desk, gathering his coat and briefcase. He knew the next step was important. He couldn't afford to back down now, especially when Hazel was starting to believe in herself again. The gallery was a modest space, tucked in an artsy part of the city, away from the glitzy, high-end venues Theodore usually frequented. It wasn't the kind of place his colleagues would ever step foot in, but it didn't matter. This was Hazel's world, her art, her rules. When Theodore arrived, the low hum of chatter filled the air as people milled about, admiring the pieces on display. It was clear that Hazel's work had made an impression, with several pieces already being eyed by potential buyers. He spotted her across the room, talking with a couple of gallery visitors, her hands animated as she spoke. She was glowing tonight, confident, poised, yet still carrying that touch of vulnerability that made her who she was. When she caught his gaze, her face softened into a smile that made his heart skip a beat. Hazel, walking toward him, a hint of uncertainty in her voice. I didn't expect you to come. Theodore, smiling warmly, his voice steady. I wouldn't miss it for the world. There was a brief moment of silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that felt like an unspoken agreement. Something was shifting between them, something deep and unspoken. Hazel, glancing around at the crowd. It's surreal, you know? All these people here, looking at my work. It's like they see something I never saw in myself. Theodore's gaze softened as he looked at her, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He stepped closer, his voice quiet but sincere. Theodore, you were always meant for this, Hazel. I knew that the first time I saw you. All you needed was someone who believed in you. Hazel looked up at him, her eyes searching his for any hint of doubt. But all she found was unwavering belief. She smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. Hazel, softly, thank you for believing. Theodore reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, grounding her in that moment. Theodore, with conviction, you don't have to thank me. You've earned this. Now, let's see where this takes us. Together. Hazel nodded, her eyes glimmering with something Theodore couldn't quite place: hope, maybe, or the beginnings of trust. Either way, he was ready. He was all in. As the night wore on, Theodore stayed by Hazel's side, watching her interact with potential buyers, seeing the pride in her eyes as she spoke about her work. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to face whatever challenges came their way. For Hazel, for them. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't just her art that was beginning to thrive, it was their future, one step at a time. The old friend, Caroline, stood with a sly smile, waiting for Hazel's decision. Her presence was like a ghost from Hazel's past, a reminder of who she used to be: reckless, driven, and always chasing the next big opportunity. But now, Hazel was different. She had built a life, found peace, and felt a sense of belonging she hadn't known before. Hazel, hesitating, "I've worked so hard to get here, Caroline. I can't just walk away from everything. It's not who I am anymore." Caroline raised an eyebrow, sensing the hesitation. She took a step closer, her voice soft but coaxing. "Caroline, but Hazel, this is your chance. A real gallery show. You know how rare this is. Don't you miss the feeling of being seen? Of being appreciated for your work? You could have all of that again. And more." Hazel's heart fluttered at the thought, but she clenched her fists, reminding herself that there was more to life now. Hazel, shaking her head, "I found something real here. I'm happy." She glanced toward Theodore, who had just entered the room, his face unreadable. "You don't understand." Theodore's eyes hardened as he overheard the conversation. His shoulders tensed, and he stepped forward, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Theodore, so that's it, huh? You're just gonna throw everything away for some gallery show? For some past that doesn't even matter anymore?" Hazel turned to face him, but the hurt in his eyes made her stomach twist. "Hazel, Theodore, it's not like that. I'm not throwing anything away. It's a big decision, and I have to think about it." "Theodore, no, Hazel. You've already made your decision." He looks at Caroline with disdain. "You're just waiting for the right moment to leave. And I guess I'm not part of that moment, huh?" Hazel's chest tightened as she stepped toward him, desperate to explain, but he backed away, his expression hardening. "Hazel, Theodore, please. It's not what you think." Theodore, with a bitter laugh, "Isn't it? It's the same pattern, Hazel. You always chase the next thing, the next dream, but you never stop to see what you already have. And now, you're willing to risk everything for a piece of your old life." Hazel's eyes welled up, and she opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She wanted to explain. She wanted to tell him that this wasn't about her old life. It was about finding balance. But before she could, Theodore turned and walked out the door, slamming it behind him. Caroline watched the exchange with quiet amusement, then leaned in closer to Hazel. "Caroline, well, looks like you've got a choice to make. Don't keep me waiting." Hazel stood there, torn between her past and her present. Hazel stood frozen, her mind swirling with the weight of Caroline's words and Theodore's betrayal. The door slammed behind Theodore, leaving a deafening silence in the room. Caroline, ever the provocateur, waited for Hazel to make her move, but Hazel couldn't shake the feeling that everything was slipping away. "Hazel," softly, almost to herself, "what am I doing?" Caroline took a step closer, her voice laced with subtle manipulation. "Caroline, you're choosing Hazel. That's all. Your art, your career, it's all waiting for you. And so is your old life, the one that made you feel alive." Hazel's gaze flickered between Caroline and the door where Theodore had disappeared. Her mind was screaming at her to make a choice, but it felt like every path led to losing something precious. Hazel, shaking her head, "I don't know if I can just go back. It's not the same." Caroline smiled, sensing Hazel's internal struggle. "Caroline, life's not about staying still, Hazel. You know that. You can't let this place hold you down forever." Hazel closed her eyes, the memories of her past rushing back, nights spent chasing the next big break, the thrill of gallery openings, the praise of critics. It had all felt so important back then, so necessary. But now it felt hollow. And Theodore had become her anchor, her reason for grounding herself. She turned away from Caroline, her heart aching, torn between the pull of the past and the future she had started to build. "Hazel, quietly, I've changed. I've built something real. I can't just leave it behind. Not for something that might never be enough." Caroline's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, her tone shifting. "Caroline, you always were a dreamer, Hazel. But you're not a kid anymore. If you don't seize this chance, you'll regret it. And trust me, you'll never find peace in this little life you've built." Hazel flinched at her words, but then a thought struck her. Was this really the life she wanted? The quiet, safe life with Theodore? Or the life of her dreams, a life filled with art, success, and validation? But as the idea settled in her mind, she felt the familiar tug of guilt. Hazel, voice trembling. Theodore won't understand. I can't hurt him like this. Caroline stepped back, her expression softening for a brief moment. Caroline, you're not hurting him. You're giving yourself a chance. You can't keep living in his shadow, Hazel. You've got to find your own light again. Hazel glanced at the door again, her heart pounding. She could hear Theodore's footsteps retreating into the distance. Was this the end of them? Or could she fix it? Could she find a way to balance the past and the future, to chase her dreams without losing what she had? Hazel, whispering to herself, I need to make a decision. Suddenly, she turned and rushed out the door, her breath shallow and rapid. Caroline watched her go with a knowing smile. But this time, Hazel wasn't running toward the past. She was running toward something more, something she hoped would be enough to make it all worth it. Outside, the night air was crisp and the city lights shimmered in the distance. Hazel caught sight of Theodore across the street, his figure silhouetted against the glow. She took a deep breath and walked toward him, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Hazel, softly calling out, Theodore, wait. He stopped, his back still turned, his shoulders tense. She could see the anger and hurt in the way he stood, but she wouldn't give up, not without explaining. Hazel, reaching him, I don't want to lose you, but I can't ignore this. This opportunity, it's everything I've worked for. I'm scared, Theodore, but I need you to understand, I need to do this for myself. Theodore turned to face her, his expression unreadable. There was a long pause as he stared at her, and for a moment, Hazel wasn't sure if he would say anything at all. But then his eyes softened, and he let out a sigh. Theodore, I get it, Hazel. I do. But it's not just about you anymore. It's about us. We have to figure out what we want together. Hazel's heart skipped a beat. She reached for his hand, but he pulled away slightly, not ready to forgive. Hazel, urgently, I'm not saying I'll walk away from us, but I can't walk away from myself either. I need to find a way to have both. Theodore looked at her for a long moment, his expression torn. Then he spoke, his voice low. Theodore, then you better figure out how, Hazel, because I can't keep waiting for you to choose. He turned and walked away, leaving Hazel standing in the cold night air, her heart heavy but determined. The decision was hers to make. She could no longer hold on to both worlds. But which one would she choose? Hazel walks down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. She knows Theodore doesn't understand, but this opportunity, this offer is too important to ignore. As she reaches the door, she pauses, glancing back at the empty room. The argument echoes in her mind, a bitter reminder of how hard it's become to keep things together. Hazel, muttering to herself, he'll never get it. He doesn't see the bigger picture. With a heavy sigh, she pushes the door open and steps outside, the cool night air biting at her skin. She pulls her coat tighter around her, feeling the weight of the decision pressing on her shoulders. Her phone buzzes in her pocket. It's a message from her mentor, confirming the meeting for tomorrow. Meanwhile, Theodore stands in the doorway, watching Hazel's retreating figure. His anger melts into frustration as he runs a hand through his hair. He's afraid of losing her, afraid of what this choice means for their future. Theodore softly, to himself, I don't know if I can do this without her. The next morning, Hazel sits in a sleek, modern cafe, waiting for her mentor. She taps her fingers on the table, trying to calm her nerves. The excitement of the opportunity mixes with a nagging feeling of guilt over Theodore. When her mentor, a sharp-dressed woman in her early 40s, walks in, Hazel stands to greet her with a strained smile. The woman sits down across from her, her eyes scanning Hazel's face, noting the tension. Mentor, you don't look ready, Hazel. This is your chance to make it big. You know that, right? Hazel hesitates, then nods, trying to ignore the pang of doubt. The mentor continues, her voice steady. Mentor, but you've got to be certain. You can't back out when things get tough. You have to own this choice. Hazel glances down at her phone, feeling the weight of Theodore's S last message lingering in her mind. Her finger hovers over the screen, debating whether to reply. Later that evening, Theodore sits in his apartment, staring at the clock. He knows he needs to do something, but the words won't come. Finally, he grabs his coat and heads out, his destination clear: Hazel. As he arrives at the cafe, he spots her through the window, deep in conversation with her mentor. His stomach churns, a knot of jealousy and confusion tightening inside him. He takes a deep breath and pushes the door open, walking inside. The sound of the bell jingles as he steps into the warm glow of the cafe, his eyes locking with Hazel's. Theodore quietly: "I'm not going to let this be the end, Hazel." Hazel stands, the weight of the moment hanging in the air between them. She opens her mouth to speak, but words fail her. "Hazel, I don't know how we fix this, Theodore." He takes a step closer, his voice soft but determined. "Theodore, we'll figure it out. Together. But not like this. Not if you throw everything away." Hazel looks into his eyes, torn between the life she's always known and the uncertain future ahead of her. A silence falls between them as the world outside seems to fade away. Hazel looks at Theodore, her heart torn in two. The silence stretches, heavy with the weight of unspoken words. She takes a shaky breath, finally speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hazel, I'm not throwing everything away. I need something more than this. I need to know I can be more than just us." Theodore's expression softens, his frustration melting into something deeper: fear, hurt, but also understanding. He steps closer, his voice gentle. "Theodore, I never said you couldn't be more, Hazel. But what I'm asking is, why does it have to be now? Why does it have to mean leaving everything behind?" Hazel's eyes flicker with uncertainty, and she takes a step back, running a hand through her hair in frustration. "Hazel, because this is my moment, Theodore. I've been stuck in the same place for so long, afraid to move. But this is something real. It's my shot at something bigger than what we built." Theodore looks at her, his jaw tight, but he tries to keep his voice steady. "Theodore, and what happens if that bigger thing isn't what you thought it would be? What happens if you go, and you realize you were chasing something that wasn't meant for you?" The words hit her harder than she expects, and for a moment, Hazel falters. She looks down at the table, her thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and desire. Her mentor watches them quietly, sensing the tension. Mentor, softly, to herself, "This isn't just about ambition. This is about choice." Hazel takes another deep breath and turns back to Theodore, her eyes filled with a mixture of resolve and pain. "Hazel, I don't know, Theodore. Maybe I'll regret it. Maybe I won't. But I have to know. I can't keep living in this fear of the unknown." Theodore reaches out, gently grasping her hand, his touch warm and grounding. Theodore earnestly, "You don't have to do this alone, Hazel. We can face the unknown together. I'm not asking you to stay for me. I'm asking you to trust that we can build something, even if it's different than what we imagined." Hazel looks at his hand, feeling the pull of his words, the weight of everything between them. She opens her mouth to respond, but before she can speak, her phone buzzes on the table, pulling her attention. It's a message from her mentor. Mentor's message: "This is the real deal, Hazel. Think carefully. Opportunity doesn't wait." Hazel looks up at Theodore, her gaze filled with confusion, her heart torn in two. She wants to believe in him, in them, but the promise of the opportunity is too tempting, too hard to ignore. She stands slowly, pulling her hand away from his. The room feels colder now, the distance between them widening. "Hazel, I need time, Theodore. I can't give you an answer right now." Theodore stands up as well, his face a mask of quiet pain. He wants to argue, to make her see reason, but he knows that this is something she has to do on her own. "Theodore, I'll give you time, but just know, I'm not going anywhere. You can come back when you're ready." Hazel nods, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, and she turns to leave, her steps echoing in the silence of the cafe. Hazel, crossing her arms, avoiding his gaze. "Theodore, it's not about you caring. It's about me needing space. I'm trying to figure out things on my own, and you pushing me only makes it harder." Theodore, softening, stepping closer. I get that. I didn't mean to make you feel trapped. I can't stand the thought of you being hurt, especially when I know I could be there for you. Hazel pauses, her walls coming down just a little. It's not just about you being there. It's about me needing to find my own way without feeling like I'm being controlled or judged. Theodore, sighing, running a hand through his hair. I never meant to judge you. I just get worried when you shut me out. I care about you more than I've cared about anyone. That scares me. Hazel, softly, almost to herself. I'm scared too, Theodore. I don't know if I can handle being close to anyone right now. Not when everything feels so messy. Theodore, looking directly at her, his voice steady. Then let me help you sort through the mess. I'll be here, whether you want me to be close or just want me to listen. Hazel, looking up, meeting his gaze for the first time. I'm not sure I'm ready for that, but maybe we can figure it out, one step at a time? Theodore, nodding. One step at a time, no pressure. Just you and me figuring this out. Together.